What are object properties? Every object you create, whether it's an outline or a fill, will have properties that can be tweaked or even changed fairly dramatically. Sometimes, though, that's not such a good idea. The stitch out may not be all that good if you exaggerate the differences too much. But I'll talk about that more as we go along. Now, the beauty of the Bernina software is that it has inbuilt defaults for the properties for each of the stitches. So you can happily digitize objects and use the fills and outlines, and they will stitch reasonably well, well actually very well, just with the basic default properties. But sometimes you want to tweak them. Now the basic defaults when you open your software are standard for average weight fabric and stabilizer. But if you're using a specialty fabric, a knit or a terry toweling, or you're using a heavyweight fabric or a lightweight fabric, you can set the fabric before you start, and those defaults will be changed slightly to be more suitable for those fabrics. And I've got a separate video on that, which I'll link to below. So it's worth watching that as well. I'm just going to use the standard. I'm not going to set a fabric. So there's no fabric down here. If you've set a fabric, it will show up down here at the bottom of your screen. But I'll just use the standard for this video. So because the purpose of this series of videos is to explain what all the different object properties do for each of the outlines and fills. Okay, how do you access the object properties? There are two ways of setting object properties. You can set them before you digitize. If you do that, every object of that same outline stitch or fill stitch will have the properties you set applied, not the defaults. If you digitize an object and then set the object properties, only that object will have those properties. So if you create another object, it will have the default properties again. So if you're going to create a lot of objects and you want them all to have the same properties, then you are better off setting the properties before you digitize. But if you only want to change the properties of one object, digitize the object and then change the properties. So you can access the properties from this icon at the top. So you can left click on it and the object properties will open. So that's just to the left of the effects icon, the little wheel. There's a little page with a red arrow, and that's object properties. And the dialog will default to single stitch outline. Because I've got no objects selected, it doesn't really know what properties I want to change or set. So if I particularly want to change the properties for a satin outline, for instance, I would drop down this menu and I could choose the satin outline and look at the properties for that and change those. Any of the outlines can be changed by just clicking on the type of outline here, backstitch for instance, and you will get the properties for that type of stitch. If I want to change the properties for fill stitch, I need to click on the fill stitch tab at the top here, and then I've got all the options for fill stitch types here. I can choose the fancy fill for instance, and the object properties for fancy fill will come up. I can also change all sorts of other things along here, but basically I'm looking at the properties for the outline stitches and the fill stitches in this series. Okay, so that's one way of accessing the properties prior to digitizing. The other way, I'll just close that, is to actually right click on the stitch that you want to change the properties for. So if I'm creating a blanket stitch, I'll right click on the blanket stitch and the object properties will open at blanket stitch for me straight away, which makes it a little bit quicker rather than dropping down a menu and choosing. I can still change this by dropping down the menu and choosing another one here if I like. So that's how you would access it before you digitize. If you want to access it after you've digitized, so you want to change the properties of that object only, then you need to create the object first. So I'll close that and let's create an object. So let's do an open object, which means I have to use an outline stitch. Let's choose the single outline and let's choose red just because I can. And let's digitize a little object here. So I'm using a series of right clicks and left click at each end to create my object, and then I'm hitting enter. And here's my object. Now I can select that object and I can either right click here inside these selection handles, or I can right click on the color film and the object properties for that object will come up. So I'll right click here and, well, it won't come up straight away. I've got all sorts of other options, but at the top you've got the choice of object properties. You click on that and your object properties box will open. I'll just move it over to the side a bit and I'll just move this across there so we can see both. Okay, so I digitized a single outline object, so it's automatically gone to single outline properties. There's not much you can change with a single outline. You can change the stitch length and you can change the variable run length. So the stitch length, the default is 2, and that's why we got an object, because it knew how long to make the stitches by using the default. I can change that to 4 if I want to make longer stitches. Remembering, apply that. So I'm applying so that the box stays open. If you hit on OK, the box will close and you'll need to reopen it. So I just clicked on apply. It's a bit hard to see that I've even done anything here on a single outline, but if I go out of true view, you can see the needle penetrations by the little white dots, provided you've got this little show needle points highlighted up here. So I'll just put it back to 2 so you can see the difference and apply that. So I've got more little white dots, more needle penetrations. Remember that if you make long stitches, they're going to pull more, so you'll need good stabilization and or a very firm fabric, or a combination of both. So they're things to keep in mind. Also, long stitches tend to catch more, so they're not so suitable for children's garments and things like that that are going to, or anything that's going to be laundered heavily, because they tend to be looser and can catch more and wear more. What is variable run length? And you'll see that it's defaulted to 1. They're all auto-filled. You can change them, but the variable run length for single outline is 1 millimeter, and that is so that if you've got a very tight corner, it can reduce the stitch length down to 1 so that you can get around that corner with a more smooth line of stitching. Let me just digitize something really tight quickly so that I can demonstrate that. So we'll get an open object. We've got our single run again, and this time I'm going to do a really tight curve and enter. And if I zoom in on that, if I take off the variable run length, you can see the needle penetrations here when you're not in true view. If I take that off and apply, couldn't really see any difference. Let me just turn it back on again and apply, and let's see if I can reshape this to make it even tighter. Let's move that up there. So I've got a really tight corner here. Right, so you can see here I've got my outlines showing, and you can see the actual line that was created by digitizing, and the red stitching here can't quite get round that corner even with the variable run length on, because it's such a tight corner. But I'm zoomed right in, so if I'm at 3,500 times the actual size of the stitching, so that would be hardly noticeable. If I get back to, I'll just go out of, go back to select. If I get back to 100%, you would never be able to tell that that is not a curve around there. at that size. So I'll go into True View and click off so you can see it is slightly jagged, but you're not going to get any better than that. But if I didn't have the variable run length on, let's select it again so I can change that, turn that off and apply. You can see it's much more jagged. Let's zoom right in. It's actually made a little V. I'll turn off the True View and make sure my go to the reshape tool, and that will show the digitizing line here and the stitching. It couldn't get around there at all. It's just gone from here down to here. There's a needle penetration there. Then it's just made this little V. So that is what variable run length does. I'll just apply it again, and you can see it managed to trace the curve a lot better with it applied. So most of the time you will want that turned on. Okay, so that basically covers the object properties for a single outline stitch. Let's have a look at the triple and see what options we've got there. So I'll keep this object and I will change it to a triple and apply. And we can't really see much because I'm not in True View, but if I go out into True View, it looks a bit thicker. So each of those stitches is stitched 3 times in a triple run. So it goes forwards, backwards, forwards, and then it moves on forwards, backwards, forwards. The triple length default is 2.5, so a little bit longer than the single length, and that means that getting around curves is even harder. Let's go out of True View and go to the reshape tool. It didn't do too bad a job at all though, and because I have variable run length turned on, so it's got a 1mm variable run length. Let's turn that off and apply, and again I've got that V shape, and even across here it's gone square across here instead of following the curve. Just couldn't do it because of the length of the stitch. So turn that back on and apply. So not much difference between the single and the triple as far as object properties go, except that the default is a little bit longer. Because you're stitching into the same stitch 3 times, there's a lot of needle penetration. So there are good reasons for the defaults, but as I said, you can tweak those a little bit if you want to. So you could make that stitch a little bit shorter, you could make it a little bit longer. Just don't go too extreme. Okay, now the sculpture run, which is 3 stitches, then a single stitch, then 3 stitches and a single stitch. So again, it's not really going to look any different on screen much. I'll apply that, except that the variable run length is not applied by default. The reason being, a lot of quilters use this stitch to make it look a bit like a quilting stitch. So the single stitch, if it's similar colour to the fabric, tends to blend into the fabric and it starts to look like a hand quilted stitch. And quilters don't like to have varying stitch lengths in their quilting stitches. They like to have them all the same length. So by default, that's turned off. But that doesn't mean you can't have it if you don't want to. There's no stitch police, as I was told many years ago. So we'll turn that back on and apply it and see what happens, because you can see here I've got this V again. So if I apply that, I get a closer following. But I've got little short stitches here. I've got a little short stitch here. So if I go into True View, it does look more uneven as it goes around the curve. Alright, again, this is a very small object. So on a bigger object, let's select this one. And let's apply that, change that to the sculpture run and apply. And I'll go out of... I've just got it selected now without the reshape, and I'll go out of True View. Again, because it's a smooth curve to start with, it's not got any short stitches anywhere along there. So whether or not I apply the variable run length did make a little difference. I saw those stitches move, so it has made a little bit of difference, but it's not as dramatic as when you've got a very small tight curve. All right, let's go move that over there so I can keep looking at that one. All right, let's try and make this now a back stitch. Actually, I'll use this one for the back stitch. A tight curve on a back stitch is going, oh well, let's start with this one. We'll make that a back stitch. Tight curves with a back stitch are going to be more difficult as well because of the nature of the stitch. So we'll apply that and we'll go into True View. Oh, sorry, I tried to zoom into here. And you can see that it starts to get quite jaggedy around curves. So let's go out of True View. Because of the nature of the way the stitch is formed. So choosing which stitch and what shape you're using are things you need to think about. Sorry, choosing which stitch you're using for a particular shape is what you need to think about. There are a few more options in backstitch in the properties. By default, its stitch length is 3 millimeters. I'm going to leave it at the default. Stitch thickness. Now, if I'm hovering over the word stitch thickness or even the numbers of the defaults, it will show little blue arrows over here in the preview box of what it's actually measuring. So stitch length is 1 stitch unit, the full length of each stitch unit. They do overlap in backstitch, but you can see there that what a stitch unit is and how long it is. Stitch thickness is the distance between the highest, the start point and where it back stitches to. So basically how thick it's stitching, because it's not stitching on top of itself, it's stitching next to itself. This has a drop down option box rather than typing in, so it's got suggestions of 0.15, 0.2 or 0.25. Let's change it to 0.25 and apply that. And you can see that it's a little bit wider, so it's a little bit more messy as you get round corners, but that might be a good look for what you're doing. So just experiment and see what you like. Let's put it in True View and let's go back to the point, well, let's go down to 0.15, which is the thinnest. And you can see that it's a smoother looking stitch, but it's still got a little bit of texture to it. Now the overlap is how far, if we hover over it, how far each stitch unit overlaps. So by default it's on 50, you can go up to 70 and apply, and you'll get more overlap, or you can go down to 30 and apply and you'll get less overlap, just a tiny bit here. So again, each gives a different look. Now if you're going to experiment with all your stitches, you may wish to create rows of stitches with different properties and stitch them out. You could fill a whole hoop with different stitch types and their properties, and then stitch them out and write on next to them what properties you used, and then you can file those samples away for future reference if you would like to remember a particular style then, or if you want to just make a decision about the look of a stitch, you can refer back to that. Otherwise you're relying on the screen and it's not always super accurate about, or doesn't give you a really perfect view of what it's actually going to stitch like. It's not bad, but it's not the same as having an actual stitched out sample. Now we did overlap, we've got strokes. So the first option is the default, which is 3 strokes. If I go to 5 strokes, I'm going to get a more textured look. So I'll put 5 in there and apply. And you can see it's more bulky because it's stitching backwards and forwards more times. That can be a very interesting outline. Okay, so that's backstitch properties explained, hopefully. If you've got any questions, put them in the comments below or contact me on my Facebook page, Machine Embroidery and Digitising, and I will endeavour to answer them. Okay, stem stitch. It's very similar things, so let's apply that. It's a different stitch altogether though, and look how this small object really isn't suitable for stem stitch. You've got this messy bit here where it tried to get around that tight curve. So again, think about what stitch you're using for a particular object. So let's, in this case, use this object here. I'll bring it over here, and let's change that to stem stitch and apply. Okay, so this is what stem stitch looks like in a much more smooth curve or even a straight line. Okay, so the line thickness is the first option, and we talked about that with the back stitch as well. So we've got a drop down menu there as well. Let's go to 3 and apply, and actually that's the width of it is probably another way to describe that. Spacing is the distance between each individual unit, so 1.5 is the option. Now you can type anything you like in there because you've got arrows here for minor adjustments, so that's 1/100th of a millimetre adjustment for each click on each arrow, or you can type over. So let's make that 2 so it's obvious and apply that. And you can see that spaced it out much more. So if you want a more open looking stitch, make this number bigger. The angle defaults to 45. Let's put that at 75 and see what that does. Apply, and you can see it's starting to be more more like a zigzag, more upright. If we go down to 20 and apply that, we've got a much steeper angle, so a totally different look, and that could be quite interesting depending on what you're digitizing. Stitch thickness is how close together each overlap is. So I'll zoom into this again now. And stitch thickness, we've got a drop down menu for that too. So let's go to 25 and make it a bit thicker. Apply, and you can see that that has made this slightly thicker. We've got triple by default. If I go to single and apply that, it's taking out an extra couple of stitches in here, so it's more or less each of these is a single. It doesn't go backwards and forwards here more than once. Okay, let's change this to zigzag and apply. Now, for some reason, they put an auto underlay in zigzag. I'm going to turn off the underlay with the underlay icon down here. It's very rare that you'd want an underlay under zigzag because zigzag is open. So I'm not sure why the underlay is on by default, but it is. So I've just taken that out, and I would advise you to do the same. If you make the spacing a lot smaller, it will close up, and then you could have an underlay under it, but then you may as well use your satin outline. So zigzag is slightly different to satin. Satin, I'll create a duplicate of this, put it there. Okay, and I'll make this one a satin outline and apply, and I'm going to open up the satin line so that it's open like this. So it's got no underlay at the moment, so I'm going to choose manual spacing, and I'll make that 2 and apply. Okay, so you can see the angle of the stitches is different on satin. It's more italic looking, it's got a lean to it, whereas zigzag is just a series of V's, inverted V's, and then an upright V, but there is more of an angle on satin stitch, which gives it a smoother look. So you wouldn't want to, if I go back to this one, you wouldn't necessarily want to change the spacing close down to say 0.4 and apply. That will look like a satin, but it's not going to look the same as a satin if you stitch them side by side because of the angle of the stitching. The only other option with zigzag is, so you've got your spacing. I forget what the original was now. Let's go 2.5 and apply. That was pretty close. Is your width. So you can change your width to 4, 5. Let's go 5. I probably wouldn't go any more than 5 because again you're going to get long stitches that can catch and it won't wear well and will apply a lot of pull to your design. I'll just apply that. So that basic, but it actually changes the width. So you can go up in smaller increments and slightly tweak it if you so desire. So I'll delete that object now because we've got a satin one up here. So I'll select that and delete. And we'll select this one and we'll go back to the satin. So I'll go back to automatic spacing and apply that and put my underlay back on. Underlay is another topic which I'll cover in another video altogether. You can tweak underlays as well, and there are various times when you want to change the underlay or even add a second underlay. So we'll talk about that another time in another video. Okay, so we've got automatic spacing or we've got manual. When we choose manual, we can actually decide whether we want to open up that satin or make it more dense by increasing or decreasing this number. So the larger the number always, the more open the stitching, the smaller the number, the more dense the stitching. Down here, there's a box. I'm in the creator level, so it just says satin. I'm not sure in the Designer Plus whether you've got a radio button for Satin Special down here, but it is showing two different types of satin, and you can tell by the needle, black needle mark dots here, that there is one at each side of the satin. So the needle is penetrating on either side and not in between. Now as you get wider, in satin, it will not create any needle penetrations in between. Now down here, it's got needle penetrations in between, but there's no radio button to choose it. And that it would be when you get too wide a stitch. You would want extra needle penetrations, but you can't choose it. So I'm not sure why that's there, to be honest. If you do get too wide, so let's change this to 12, a really wide satin stitch, which I wouldn't use, but let's do this. So we'll change that to 12 and apply that. And I'm going to put it back on automatic spacing and apply. There we go. So I've got a really wide satin stitch. Let's turn off the underlay so it doesn't confuse us and go out of true view, and you can see that there are only needle penetrations on either side. Let's go up to 15 and apply that, and now I can see little dots here. Now these aren't needle penetrations. You can tell because these are kind of like jump stitches. They're dotted, they're not solid lines where the thread goes across. But what is happening here is that the maximum stitch length has been exceeded. I think it's 12.7, something like that. I'll have a look later. When the maximum stitch length for the machine has been exceeded in the software, what will happen is that it will create jumps at a certain length. And so it's stitching here, and then it's jumping to here, and then jumping again, and then coming over here and stitching. So it will slow the machine down, but it will stitch it like a satin. But again, 15 millimeters, that's 1.5 centimeters width. That is going to be way too wide. It's going to pull like crazy, so you wouldn't want to do that. But I just thought I would show you that so that you understand what's going on if you do happen to sit at a really wide width and you wonder what's going on. I certainly for satin wouldn't go any more than, usually only go 4, but you know, probably push it at 5 millimeters satin width and apply that. And as you can see, we've now got solid lines. That's going to stitch happily out on the machine, but again, you will need good stabilizer, good underlay, and to keep your fabric from pulling too much. Okay, so hopefully I've explained. Oh no, we've got offset and center. So when you digitize a satin line, it will center over the digitizing line. If I select this, which it is because it's pink, and go to the reshape tool, you can see my nodes. Zoom out, I've got a node here and I've got a node here, and if I, let's just move across, I've got a node here and a node here, so it's in the middle of the line. Now for some purposes you may want the satin to sit on the edge of the line, and then you can use the offset. So if I click in the offset and apply that, you'll see that the satin moved so that the digitizing line is along the top edge. Now if you wanted to get it on the bottom edge, you have to think about that before you digitize. I don't think I can fix it by moving the start and end points. I'll try, but I'll move the start point up to this end and the end point. No, I don't want that. I want the hand. There we go. The end point back there. And nothing happened. My digitizing line is still on the top. But if I set up, prior to digitizing, I set up the offset. Let's try digitizing from right to left. I'll just go OK for the moment. I'll right click on my satin. Oh, it's still on offset. Oh, because I've still selected. Click off. OK. Now, I'll close that. If I right click on my satin outline and I set it on offset before I start and apply, I go OK. Now if I digitize an open object, satin, and digitize from right to left and enter. Let's go to the reshape tool, and yes, this time the digitizing line is on the bottom. So depending on what you're doing, that's the direction you should digitize your line. So if I select this one again on the top and go to the reshape tool, you can see that the digitizing line was on the top because I digitized this from left to right. So that would be one instance where you would want to set up your object properties before you start digitizing if you particularly wanted your offset to go in a certain direction compared to the digitizing line. Alright, this video's got long enough, so I'm going to stop here. When I come back with the next video, I will cover some more outline stitches and fills as I move on through all of the stitch types. I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you very much.